Hi, welcome to the June 2025 version of our genealogy series at the Spartanburg County Public Libraries. My name is Charity Rouse. I am the Director of Local History, and it is my pleasure to have you all with me either live on Zoom or watching the recording on the library's YouTube page. Tonight, we're going to be talking about some genealogy travel tips. Some of these are things I have learned the hard way. Some of these things are things I learned from other people. And feel free to put anything in the chat if something sparks a memory or a tip that you have learned through your genealogy. I have done genealogy travel in the US. I have done genealogy travel, 2 trips, one to Great Britain, United Kingdom, British Isles, not sure what you call them when you got both Ireland and Northern Ireland in the mix, as well as my trip last fall to France, Belgium, and Germany. And there was a lot of research on that trip, but less family research. Um, my family has been in Virginia, into North Carolina, and a little bit in South Carolina, part of it in South Carolina, for a very long time. Most of my immigrants came in prior to 1700. Those I have found. I'm still working on a couple lines that dead end about 200 years ago. So, just really trying to find out more about my history and things that you can do to learn more about your family's history. So, whether you are heading to a family reunion, on a research trip, or just to a cemetery this summer, it's important to make the most of your time and budget for the trip. Join us as we explore how to prepare for your trip, make the best of your time when you only have an hour, and some reminders for accessing cemeteries on private property. Um, and we'll talk a little bit at the end about how to preserve your photos and notes for future access. The photo on the right is a photo that I happened into at a family reunion last summer. The building on the right is a church that was a Methodist church outside of a little town called Latta, South Carolina. It's called Dothan Methodist Church. And the building behind it is a schoolhouse that had students, um, primarily Black students, but also apparently some white students. And the picture indicates that I don't have my glasses angled correctly here. Um, the church was built in, looks like 1853. And so it's just something that family member had. They put on display at one of the events for the reunion. And I was able to get a snapshot of it. It's not great. It was in plastic, and you can see the flash and the lights above me reflecting on that. So, when you are going to do a trip, you need to have a plan and some goals. Why you're doing the trip, is this the primary reason for the trip? Is this secondary research? Who else is going on the trip? Where are you going? And where can you research while you're there? Um, Knowing when you want to go or when you are able to travel means that sometimes the season or the weather makes it more or less difficult to connect with the people you need to connect with. Sometimes, if you're in an off season, historic sites that you may want to visit are not available to you because they're closed for the season. What do you want to see? Do you want to go to cemeteries, historical landmarks, research libraries, museums, home places? So different people prioritize different of these topics and places. And so you need to make a decision. because one thing I've learned is you can't do it all. You do have to pick and choose. But sometimes you need to have your backup plan of, hey, if I can't do this, then this and this and this would be options, because sometimes you run into challenges. You do need permissions if you are going on private property, even if once owned by your ancestors. It now belongs to the current owner, and you need to be polite and get their permission. Yes, as a descendant of someone who is buried in a particular cemetery, you have a right to visit that cemetery, but the property owner also has a right to privacy. And the last thing I want anyone to encounter is someone armed with a gun ready to shoot you for trespassing. So please do your best to find who owns that property. A deed search for the property can sometimes yield, through the Register of Deeds office, can sometimes yield a phone number or at least an address. And you can write to that address if you plan far enough ahead and ask for permission to go on the property, and give all of your contact information so they can call you or email you back more quickly. Um, and then what are you looking for? Sometimes you're looking for particular facts. We get people who travel through to the Kennedy Room regularly who are looking for facts about an ancestor to help prove their line for a lineage society like Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution, Colonial Dames, First Families of South Carolina. Whatever the group is, they're looking for specific documentation of their ancestor. Other people may just want to know, where did my ancestor live? Is the house still standing? Where are they buried? Can I go see the gravesite? So know what you're looking for, and there's a little bit of be okay with what you might need to find and you might not find. So, back in 2013, my mother and I took a little trip. We had been in Richmond for a conference. I was still living in Kansas at the time. My mother lives in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And we took a trip to Richmond County, Virginia, to a little place called North Farnham. Now, Richmond County is nowhere close to well, it's an hour and a half, something like that, away from the independent city of Richmond, which is the state capital. So just do enough research about the area to know which Richmond you needed. Um, so, but North Farnham Parish is an Episcopal parish there. It's historic. Um, and this particular church was built about 1737, but the congregation was older. Now, by 1737, I know that my Abraham Goad had already started moving west across Virginia. He ended up in a little place called Dougspur, uh, in what is now Carroll County, Virginia. And so there is a historic marker at this church. And so they restored it a couple of times. So this is not completely a building that my ancestor might have seen beginning to be built before he left the area. But we know that his land was not far from this church. And this is a picture of the church building as it stands now. And we were able to, because I knew I had a plat of his land, and I knew approximately which road that led to this church led past his property. So we spent some time driving the roads that were adjacent to his property. Now, as I said, he left that area prior to 1737. So there were no goats. My mother even went into the post office and asked the postmistress if there were any people with the surname Goad. And the postmistress said, nope, none at all. So sometimes you strike out on meeting those cousins, but other times you sometimes get a chance. Well, I had tried to call ahead once we knew what days we were going to be there to a local historical society. And unfortunately, the volunteer was out of town who going to, was scheduled to be open that day. And the person taking the messages didn't get the message until we were already on plan B. And we had decided that I had never been to Tangier Island, which has a connection with part of my father's family from the Eastern Shore. And so we headed over to Reedville. The volunteer called us as we were getting on the boat and apologized that they weren't open and we weren't able to make arrangements because I had a flight back to Kansas. So missed that opportunity, had a nice conversation with the gentleman, and we took the ferry over from Reedville to Tangier Island. Tangier Island is one of the islands in the Chesapeake Bay that is just a little lost in time. The language did not change from a more Elizabethan English until well into the era of radio and TV. This is a cemetery on Tangier Island. You will notice the concrete covers on all of the uh, plots, and that is because we are bare feet above sea level. And they got tired of having to retrieve caskets every time the water got a little high. So they've got them clamped down fairly well. As far as I know, I have no relatives in the cemetery. It was just a really cool cemetery. Um, Now, Tangier Island was visited by Captain John Smith, who gave it the name. And then it was settled later um, in 1636, John Brookett and his sons. Um, and so it also played some military uh, strategic positioning along a couple of different conflicts, including the War of 1812. So, um, one of the things that I learned on Tangier Island is that some of our favorite family foods and some of my foods that I enjoy really are culturally linked to the Eastern Shore, to the island that you wouldn't necessarily expect. This is one of the eateries. And there were also crab cakes and some other things. But you see on here in the back right is coleslaw. You see in the mid right creamed corn. In the to the left of the creamed corn are pickled beets and then green beans. Now, of those, the green beans are my least favorite. But I love pickled beets and I love creamed corn and I love coleslaw. Um, so finding out that these were typical foods of that region and that had made it through with my father's preferences to my mother's table. My father was not a cook. And so just kind of interesting to see how food traditions that we're not aware of sometimes get passed down. So let's talk a little bit about cemeteries. Um, for public and church cemeteries, generally, as long as you are there during daylight hours, pay attention to any posted rules, both on their website and on property, because some don't allow pets in the cemetery. Um, some have other restrictions. Sometimes the hours are less than dawn to dusk. Um, so, just be polite. You're a guest. Your ancestor's stone does not belong to you. You did not pay for it. And even if you did, Don't clean the stones. A little bit later, I have a picture of what happens if you do clean the stones. It can cause some damage. If there are services going on, you might hit when there's a funeral, particularly at a larger community cemetery. Just be respectful. Um, don't interrupt their services. If it is a private cemetery, if it is immediately adjacent to a public road, it's usually okay to visit. I know in the area around Latta in Dillon County, South Carolina, the private family foundation um, has that I contribute to because I'm part of that family, but they uh, care for that church that was in that first picture and 4 cemeteries. And so you can go to one of those cemeteries at any time. I've been to 2 of the other cemeteries at reunions, and someone has gotten permission to get us to those cemeteries. One of them, you have to go through a couple of farm fields, 2 fields over and hang a left through the trees to get to the swampy part where the cemetery is. And so you need to have permission of the property owner to go back there. But they are usually absolutely fine with you going back there. You just have to ask because sometimes they're doing things like logging or harvesting where they've got big machinery running and they really don't want random people in the way. The other of those 2 cemeteries, Sweat Swamp Cemetery, you actually have to go through a gated neighborhood and up somebody's driveway. The cemetery is now in the backyard of 2 of the houses in that private neighborhood. And so you really do have to have permission to get through the gate and to walk through the private cemetery or private lawn to the cemetery where ancestors are buried. So it's just good to check what you're going to need to do before you go. And things like find a grave can really help with that because once you look at the map, you realize, oh, this isn't somebody's backyard. Then contact other family who live in that area or contact Register of Deeds office, contact the local historical or genealogical society or the local library, and sometimes they're able to put you in contact with the correct people. Do be careful where you park because you're on somebody else's property. Um, and do pay attention to no trespassing signs. I couldn't find my picture of it, but one of my family cemeteries on my Rouse line, it's well, it was back in the woods, and a previous property owner, not the current property owner, um, plowed it under. But it's also a hunting club, and they don't want people on the property, and they will come after you with guns. So, or did, not the current owner, but the previous owner. So it's just one of those things where be safe. Um, Pay attention to wildlife as well as the two-legged critters, because we don't want dead genealogists. It's not good for the hobby. So this is, it sure looks like the Methodist church that was in the other picture. Similar era, similar architect. This one has had more additions to it than Dothan. But this is the Brownsville Baptist Church, established in 1759, and it is in Marlborough County, South Carolina. This is my second great grandfather, Thompson William Allen, and this is his mother's stone, Celia Hayes Allen. And it's hard to read hers in particular. It's hard to read his. You can see some of the bird droppings on his. Um, if you have to be able to get a picture of something and read it, the only thing I would recommend, there are two things I would recommend. One thing would be, yes, you can use some water. Plain water, you can use that to wet the stone. Often that will make the indents of the carving show a little bit better. You can also take a reflective surface and shine the sun or the light onto the stone at an angle to see if, or your cell phone camera, to see if you can get better reflection in the um, carving of the stone. Um, it used to be a thing to take a piece of paper and a crayon and do rubbings. Unfortunately, that wears away the stone also, particularly if the stone is in fragile condition because of type of stone chosen or the style of carving, or it's just in a place where it doesn't get much sun. And so these are shaded by magnolia trees. So they get a lot of leaves and a lot of shade, and a lot of lichens and moss grow on them. So it's just something to remember. Um, this is on the other side of my family. This is a much more recent stone. This is in the 20th century, mid 20th century. 1957 and 1977 are when these great grandparents died. And you can see an awful lot of lichen on this stone. The family was told they had gotten quality granite, and it wasn't. So they got cheated. Um, but people have been careful not to harm the carving and trying to um, clear that. There are some approved cleaning things that professionals use that are not going to damage the stone, but check the Association for Gravestone Studies, and they have recommendations there. This the stone on the right that I just put up had been cleaned at one point, and you can see where there's bleach that is causing issues. This stone of my Revolutionary War ancestor, James Gardner, um, his stone got bleached and it is disintegrating the stone. So people think that they're being helpful in cleaning that stone, but really you're not. You're getting a good picture for yourself and you're selfishly ruining the stone for everyone else. So just be careful. So before you do a trip, um, do some preliminary research. Where are the places you plan to visit? Is this domestic? Is this international? Um, what are the resources there? So, are there libraries that have local history rooms? Are there cemeteries you know that you've got ancestors buried in that you would like to go to and visit and pay your respects? Um, are there historical societies or museums? What are their hours? Are they seasonal hours? Are you looking at it in September and going in November and oops, they closed October 31st? Had that happen last fall. So, um, and the website didn't say they were closing October 31st when I looked at it in September. And then we had a nice little thing called Hurricane Helene here, and that really interrupted my planning. So sometimes I do things on the spur of the moment and without as much preparation as I should. I do not recommend it, but it's just one of those things. Who might you need to contact? Do you have relatives in the area? Do you have friends in that area? Have you contacted the library or archive or museum or historical site? Don't just trust their websites because sometimes that can get you in trouble. Do they have access restrictions? Are there things that you're going to need to request 2 days ahead of time to be able to look at? Is it request in the morning? They'll pull it for you by that afternoon. What are the access requirements? What are your goals? Is your goal to walk where your ancestors walked? Is your goal to see the house they lived in if it's still standing? Is your goal to visit the cemetery? Is your goal to research all of the documents that you can't get on the internet? Those are four very different goals and will take different amounts of time, energy, and preparation. You do need to know as much as you can about the person you're researching before you go, because you need to be in the right place. Um, and you need to know where the records are held, because sometimes the records are not held at the local level, they're held at a state or national archive. So if you go to the local level, you're not going to find the records. You're going to find the places and where they walked and maybe where they're buried, but you're not going to find the um, documents because they're often in another location. So, where do you want to visit and why? So the ancestors may have lived there, or this is where the records are kept. That's where the cemetery is. That's where the research location is. So library, archive, museum, um, historical society for the documents. Do you want to walk or drive where your ancestors walked? Roads that border their properties, cemeteries with permission, and to see the exteriors of houses where they lived. I do know some people who have had fortune with knocking on the door to a house and getting permission to come in and see the house or getting permission to walk the grounds. In Carroll County, we did get permission to drive into the cow pasture. The problem was we couldn't find the track under the tall grass to safely drive up to where the cemetery was in the woods. And so, sometimes you will get close, but not quite there. Do you want to worship at a church they attended? I have the fortune of being adjacently descended from a guy by the name of Francis McKimmey. He was an early Presbyterian pastor on the eastern shore of Virginia and Maryland. And he brought over his kinsman, could be a best friend, could be a distant cousin. It's not his nephew, as people try to claim, William Boggs. And by 1691, William Boggs is here in Virginia with Francis McKimmey and inherits from his will. So, kinsmen of some sort, either by blood or by friendship. And so he was Presbyterian minister, and we got to worship at a church, a successor church to where he was ordained in 1683, which was just a very cool experience. Um, Sometimes when you go to an archive, this is in the Marion County, South Carolina archives, somebody has done some of the work for you. This is a list of the Revolutionary veterans from that area, and it does include John Bethea. It doesn't tell me which of the John Betheas that is, whether it's senior or junior. Junior was often known as Devil John Bethea and supposedly ran with Francis Marion the Swamp Fox. Um, and there's no record of his service as far as we can tell at the moment. The older John Bethea did give supplies to the cause. Thomas Cochrane is also on there. He is another ancestor of mine. Um, and so, and John Hayes, I believe, is Celia Hayes's father or brother. Um, so there are plenty of things that you may find when you go to an archive. I was on that particular day the hunt for a document that would prove who Thompson Allen, whose tombstone you saw earlier, and Celia Hayes Allen, her husband Elias, his father, is buried in an unmarked grave. So I'm having to look at other documents to prove all of those relationships. This document in the Marion Archives, and it's in the first handful of equity cases in Marion County after it became Marion County from Georgetown County. And this is actually Elias's brother, and he died intestate, and they're having to divide things up. And there was some property from Elias's father that was supposed to be divided out to the other brothers. So they list all 7 children of Elias in here. The transcription done by a cousin on a different line, bless her, missed one of the names. So Joel is mistranscribed in that document. And so it was just one of those things where I needed to see the original. As you can tell, the original is in very fragile condition. And it is mostly readable, thank goodness. But another lesson learned. Check your photos to make sure you didn't crop something unintentionally before you leave and that they are in focus. Don't be in such a rush to just click, 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 click that you don't check behind yourself. If you're emailing things home from a microfilm machine that would email things, double check that the emails are getting to you and not getting caught in your spam filter. Because our staff is very welcome and happy to help you if you're missing 1 or 2 pages and you've been in and visited and you call us and go, we'll send those couple of pages because we know you did the work. But some places aren't able to do that backup work. So just know, and man, the handwriting, fantastic. So if you're going to a library or an archive, and particularly an archive or a larger library, like a state library or a national library, there are some questions to ask. So, research tips would include, do you need a researcher card? It's kind of like a library card, but it gives you permission to research in that archive. What IDs do you need? You often need 2 forms of ID in Europe, a driver's license and a passport. I was able to have my driver's license and passport and use my passport card as what was held at the desk at the hostel we were staying in one of the places. So having 3 forms of ID is not a bad idea because sometimes you need them in different places, and the European libraries often require 2. In the US, typically your driver's license or your passport will suffice. And they've got other, I mean, just like other things, you can bring a combination of other IDs or other documents that would add up to it, but do check because each repository has their own requirements. A lot of the time now you can start the application online. There may be costs and procedures that you need to follow. Costs for copies or scans or phone photos. I have paid 50 cents a photo for phone photos at a couple places. Sometimes copies are $1 per page. So be prepared. Sometimes they can take cash, sometimes they can't. Particularly overseas, make sure you just have cash or credit card because it just depends. There may be procedures. Can you take a scanner? Nope. Or maybe, or certain types of scanners. The wand scanners that you slide across the page are rarely, rarely allowed. Sometimes they will allow you to take a computer into the research room and a page of notes. Sometimes not. Sometimes you just get paper and pencils. So maybe print out a pedigree chart so you have names and dates and locations to work with on that particular line in that particular area. Um, Phone camera, sometimes there's a charge for the photos. Sometimes a phone camera is not allowed. I have been in clerks of court offices that do not allow you to have your cell phone in the building because they are above the courtroom and security will take your phone away. Going into that before you can go up to the clerk of court's office or down to the clerk of court's office. So it's always helpful to know those things before you try to get in the building. Um, Very often, none of the, uh, lost my train of thought. Um, anyway, oh, and in Europe, you're going to have to sign a release that you will not publish the documents you are getting. You have to, you can't make 50 copies of them, anything like that. You have one copy for your personal research only. You're not allowed to put those online, all of the things. So again, it's follow the rules and it's understand the rules. You may not understand why the rules exist, but most of the time I have found that rules exist because somebody made it difficult for everybody else. Um, and I did see a note here. Yes. Do check Google Earth and maps of the area. Do check that it's a safe part of town to be in. Know if you need to be there absolutely middle of the day when it's light versus at night or dusk or first thing in the morning. And then if you're visiting another country, make sure you have all of the appropriate adapters for their um, plugs and amount of electricity. Most of the time now, modern laptops don't need any additional step down of current, but do check because that is important. Because your phone will die. That's when you need one of those backup batteries, like our summer reading press. Um, so one of the libraries that I went in that I needed to provide two forms of identification to get my researcher's card was the National Library of Ireland. I visited there back in September of 2019. Um, and this is what my researcher card looks like. It's still valid until September 3rd of 2025. I don't think I'm making it back, unfortunately. I also didn't have, they did not have records for the era that I needed. The 1600s are a little bit of a black hole in a lot of Irish records. But I have my researcher card in my collection. Um, so, for most research institutions, you need to look at the website, call ahead if possible, because sometimes the website's not completely updated. Find out what they need for a researcher card if they need one. Sometimes you can fill things out online. Often there is a video on proper handling of items and a little quiz that you have to get a certain number of questions right that, I mean, they told you about in the video. So you have to jump through some hoops sometimes. Check their guidelines for research, posted on their website. Pencils only, lockers take a quarter. You get the quarter back usually. Copy costs or restrictions. Check the catalog ahead of time. If you know you want to see these 5 things, list those 5 things on a piece of paper or order them ahead if you can. And know what you want to look at first. But don't be so focused on I've done all my prep that you don't talk to the staff because the staff know their collection and can sometimes point you to things you didn't know to ask for that might be that treasure trove of information that you need to follow up on. Do allow extra time if they need to pull things from storage. One of the biggest things we've seen is people only allowing an hour as they're traveling up I-85. And it's one of the families that we've got a lot of stuff on. And they get through 3 different things, and we've got a stack of 20 more things for them to look at, and they're out of time. So that, preparing ahead a little bit more can be helpful. There are other times when we have nothing. Their person just didn't make it into the records that we have. And they've allowed 2 days to research in our archive. So sometimes we can point them to a cemetery or get them into the part of the county where their ancestor lived and would have been around. And so sometimes they can get that part of it. Or we can send them on to another institution that might have more records, especially if they're on the edge of the county. And county lines do change. And again, cell phones may or may not be allowed, and cell phone pictures, ask before you just start taking pictures all over the place. So, be prepared to pivot and change direction. Your volunteer might not show. I have a story in a minute. Hours might have changed, or it's a holiday. When I was in Cherbourg, France last fall, I had not thought about the fact that Veterans Day, Armistice Day, there was a really big deal. There was a foot race going through the town, and everything was closed. A few restaurants were open, but the library was closed. All of the stuff was closed. So I enjoyed walking around town and kind of envisioning what my grandfather might have experienced in World War II, which was the purpose of that trip. But sometimes your best laid plans. Now, I did get to go to an Armistice Day celebration, military band, recognitions, and all of that kind of thing. And so it's just one of those things where you look at um, the plans, and then sometimes you just, oops, didn't even think about that because it may not be as large a thing in your area. Here in the States, it's more of a let's have sales for shopping than it is let's actually take a minute to step back and respect our military history. So, um, collections may not be in the expected location. They might be at the state library for scanning and not at the local courthouse, or you may expect something to be at a state library or a regional archive, and they're held locally. And sometimes you just don't have the time or the transportation to be able to get there. Sometimes the weather does not cooperate. Thunderstorms are not good for roaming through cow pastures to a family cemetery. I missed out on seeing the grave in person of one of my War of 1812 ancestors who died in 1830 because it was a thunderstorm, and I was just glad to be in that cousin's house being entertained by the 3-year-old her 3-year-old great grandchild that she was caring for, and talking about family history. She apologized that we did not make it to that cemetery, but it was not safe for us to go out to that cemetery. Transportation may not be available for where you want to go, particularly if you are in another country and using mass transportation. You may not be able to get to the other place when you want to. And you do need to be mindful of travel companions' hopes, needs, wants for the trip too. It can't all be about your research. And I do see a question about going to Poland to research ancestry. There are research institutions located in universities in Poland. You're also going to want to look for regional archives as well as the state level archive. Um, and Google Translate will be your friend. Sometimes it messes up, but it's gotten pretty good these days. And you are going to want to contact those institutions ahead of time, probably well ahead of time, um, to allow someone who can read English, or Google Translate is helpful there, to let you know whether you've got the right repository for where your ancestors came from, or lived, um, and back and forth a little bit. And that can also sometimes allow them to have an English speaking staff member there to work with you for an appointment. Um, or they'll tell you you need to hire a local researcher who can help translate for you. Um, I didn't have problems in Germany when I went to two archives there, but I also lucked into the English speaking staff member. And luckily in Bremerhaven, it was the person who had just scanned, was working through the collection that I needed, which was pictures of train stations. So sometimes luck really does help. But a lot of universities do have research archives as well. So yeah, that's one of those things. Google it. We may have I think there's a book about doing Polish research that we may have in our collection. So your library may have it, or may be able to interlibrary loan it for you, that may tell you more about specifically Polish research in Poland. And remember, those lines, the borders of Poland have changed significantly in the 20th century. So make sure you're not needing some of the places that were not Poland at the time, if that makes sense. Okay. Um, so in Ramelton, County Donegal, in the on the northern coast of Ireland, but it is Republic of Ireland, not Northern Ireland. The building on the left is the building where my ancestor's kinsman, Francis McKimmey, was ordained in 1683. The little blue token on the left side of the building is their historical marker, and it says Francis McKimmey was ordained here in 1683 before he went off to the colonies. The building on the right, that is the first building of that Presbyterian church. The building on the right is the fourth building of that Presbyterian church, just a couple blocks away up the hill. And well, a block and a half, less than 2 blocks. Anyway, and my mother and I were able to go to church there. Um, and we did get to see the communion set that had been used at the first church. So I have been within feet of something that ancestor's kinsman touched. It is likely that William Boggs was also associated with this congregation. Um, can't prove it. A lot of the records were lost over time, but just kind of cool. Um, Now, the white building on the left had been a research room for Ramelton and all of uh, they have had a number of famous people come from Ramelton. And unfortunately, they did not have enough people visit it and support it, and they weren't able to continue to fund that research room. So the materials moved a town over to the larger library, which I couldn't get to because buses don't run on Saturdays with the frequency that they run during the week, and some other things that just made it logistically difficult to do that research. And there wasn't much to research. Um, it's now being turned, as of 2019, it was being turned into a daycare. So, you know. So, when the volunteer forgets you. So I had called ahead, I had made arrangements with the little museum in Latta because my great great grandfather, John James Rouse, went by JJ, was the town clerk and treasurer for the town of Latta, beginning in 1892 and ending with his death in 1918. I'm like, he's a a city town clerk. I can get his autograph. I can get his signature from some piece of court document, whether it had to do with anybody I knew or not. I'm still looking. Um, when I went to the town hall, they didn't have anything. They had back to 1919, but they didn't have anything 1918 and before. Okay. They said, well, check at the Latta Museum. Okay, well, that needed to happen the next time I was in town. I go there every other year for a reunion at Dothan Methodist Church, or Dothan Church now. And anyway, so I had made arrangements with a volunteer to meet me because it's by appointment only. And the volunteer didn't show, and I called, and I vaguely remembered that he said he was going to be cleaning up, doing some yard work with a crew over at the Latta Methodist Church in town. And so I drove up and stopped and, hey, does so and so happen to be here? And they called him over and he's like, I totally forgot. Let me go let you in. So followed him back over to the museum. It was just a couple blocks away. And he unlocked the door and said, feel free to look around. I'll check back in and when I get cleaned up. And he went on back to the churchyard cleanup and he came back about 2 hours later. So I mean, he knew I was a librarian, so I guess I had a I'm trustworthy kind of feel to me. But I went through and looked at the various exhibits. I went through the books that were on display, such as what was on this standing desk, and nothing had J.J. Rouse on there. Found a couple things about a couple other family members, but really nothing about my particular family members. And then I was getting to the point of had kind of run out of things that I was really interested in looking at when he finally came back. We chatted for a while and it was just, hoping, but I couldn't leave until they came back to lock up the building. So, sometimes your best laid plans don't always turn out. Um, this is the next set of pictures are of something I'm trying to research. So this is a research project in process. This is at the northernmost Blue Ridge Parkway ranger station at about mile marker 8, up near Waynesboro, um, well, Afton Mountain, where the Blue Ridge Parkway ends and the Skyline Drive begins going north. This is supposedly a barn from one of my great great uncles, who was displaced by the building of the parkway. And this barn, among other buildings, was clustered at the ranger station with a little historic park. There's a log cabin that's got documentation. There's no sign that says where they got this. I'm not quite sure where the horse came from. But anyway, this is the end of the barn. Um, and then inside the barn, they do use it for a little bit of storage. So, pretty rough construction. And it has been moved and resited. So it's just one of those things. So my other problem is I don't know which person's tree on Ancestry had the piece of paper that mentioned that this got moved. Now, I will be contacting the National Park Service and the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation to see if they have more information on where and when this barn was moved from and to this location. Of course, timing. I was there this spring before the ranger station opened for the season. So the rangers might have been able to answer some of the questions as well, but there was no one there except for a couple of people hiking. It's one of the through points to get over to the Appalachian Trail as well. So, to be continued. But that barn was supposedly great great uncle's. Um, so this is one of the pictures that always reminds me. When you're traveling with a non-genealogically driven person, you do need to take some time and do some things they want to do and not always be dragging them into libraries, archives, museums, etc. This is my mother taking photos off the Blue Ridge Parkway. A different trip than the one I just got those pictures from. Um, and on the left is her taking the picture, on the right is what she's taking the picture of. Um, I grew up straight across the center, just on the other side of the peak that you kind of see framed in by the middle of that pine tree. It's the Massanutten Peak. My mother grew up to the right on this side of that mountain in Page County, and I grew up in Harrisonburg, just on the other side of the bottom of the peak. Um, and her family spreads from this area all the way down into Carroll and Grayson counties. Just if you take the Blue Ridge Parkway, it takes you right from point A to point B, and people were on both sides of that ridge. And so it's one of those places that is very comfortable and very home-like to me. Um, Now, one of the things that when I have been researching on trips, she will sometimes uh, go do other things, historic events or historic houses, that kind of thing. And she'll find out more about the history of the area that we're in than I do because I'm looking for specific documents or people or things. And so it is nice to have someone to talk over what you found that day. Um, Another of the people I travel with regularly has a very strict one cemetery rule. So he will not go to multiple cemeteries with me. I have to pick which one. Now, sometimes that means I sneak away and go to a cemetery without him. But it's just one of those things where you need to know the people you're traveling with, but they have to understand you as well. Now, I do have to say, one of the most entertaining families that we have had in the Kennedy Room in the 11 years I have been there. Family of four, two older teenage daughters, husband, wife. Husband was the very, very intent genealogist. Wife and kids were very well trained. And he had the list of newspaper articles, obituaries that he had gotten from our index. And this is before it was online. And luckily we had enough free microfilm machines because you had to go to microfilm for the newspaper articles. And each of them sat down at a machine, got here's how these work instructions from my team. And they each had their sub list of 6 or 10 or whatever obituaries. And that family of four researched the heck out of those obituaries, and they got them out. They were in and out in under 2 hours, and they got so much accomplished. But they said, yes, and the rest of the day we get to do this, and he has to come along. And so it was how they had worked it out that they would help him with his genealogy and he would do what they wanted the other parts of the day. And so, sometimes you can make things work out. Now, I do have to say, um, many of the pictures of cemeteries that I show in my programs, my mother has taken those pictures. She is a much better photographer than I am. I take snapshots, she takes photographs. So, are there additional questions, comments, things you might have learned when you've done research? Didn't really cover the photos thing, and that is organize them in folders, file folders if they're digital, by date, by location, by name of family, that kind of thing, so you can find them. Um, I was searching through things today, trying to find, well, on Friday, trying to find some of the photos that I wanted to use, and a couple of them I couldn't find the right cell phone dump. Some things I do have organized in folders and they were easier to find. So it's just one of those things. We do have some additional resources for digitizing and storing your photographs. And we may do something uh, with that next year if people want to hear it. Oh, do we have a checklist of items that you take to a distant cemetery? Um, I try to make sure my most recent version of my ancestry tree is synced down to my family tree maker program on my computer because the number of cemeteries where I don't have cell signal and there's definitely no Wi-Fi um, is pretty large. At least for my family, a lot of them were country dwellers uh, in the mountains, some of them closer to the coast, the rest of them, but not in great cell tower reach. So I usually try to identify who I know is in that cemetery to get pictures and to visit their graves. Um, and so I usually have a printed out list of who I'm looking for. Um, if I were more organized, um, things like a mirror or a reflector, some of those like window cover reflector things that you can put in your front window, though I know people who use those because they have them in their car. I mean, I always have my cell phone, always have a cell phone charger um beyond the car charger. um some Sometimes I even not just download the tree to my computer, but sometimes I print out the lists of people who I think, or just write down the list of people who I think. Um, so those are the types of things I take to the cemetery. Um,
Charity,
yeah,
would you suggest taking any kind of like weeding tools or anything like that? Because I know a lot of people encounter briars or just overgrown
yeah.
things and
Weeding tools are not a weeding tools are not a bad thing to have with you if you've got space for them. Trimmers, because sometimes pulling away the grass and crabgrass can be helpful because sometimes you need to brush off the stone. It needs to be a soft brush, not a broom. Um, and a bottle of water is not a bad thing. I mean, both for you and sometimes for the stone. Um, but yeah, a weeder, uh, one of those little claw things that just don't
yeah,
touch the
like a
stone, just get the
trowel type
grass.
thing.
Trowel, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and especially if the crabgrass has grown over, particularly on the cemeteries where it's a flat stone, not a standing stone, you sometimes have grass growing over it. Um, Again, I know that there are people who do more with the cemetery stones or who are um, taking pictures for online, like Find a Grave or Billion Graves, that kind of thing, that have more of a kit. I tend to be a lot of disturb it as the least amount possible. um, because there is someone, who is technically responsible for the cemeteries. Now, a lot of the family cemeteries off in the middle of a cow pasture or the woods don't get as much love as the ones that are regularly visited or still active as burying places. And so, yeah, those can get a little more weedy and that kind of thing. Do take bug spray, sunscreen, a hat if you are prone to sunburning. Um, and don't wear sandals. Wear hiking boots or shoes. Um, long pants would be recommended, which is a real pain when it's hot outside, but it can save you a lot of bug bites and protect from things like snakes. Um, so it depends on what season you're going in. If it's during hunting season, definitely don't go far off the main road. Um, Again, we want safe genealogists and live genealogists, not unintended consequences. So yeah, those are the types of things I would take with me to the cemetery. Um, and there have been times when I have had to search entire sections of cemeteries to find a stone. Um, I was very irritated one of the times I was in Latta at the Magnolia Cemetery, where my great grandparents and a couple siblings on the Rouse side, and my great grandparents on the Allen side, and great great grandparents on the Allen side are buried. And finally realized that on one side of the stone, which is the side I was looking at it from, was the sister's married name. On the other side of the stone was Allen, where the great great grandparents were buried. And so I just had to go a little further afield from where I thought the stone was and look back and go, oh, that's the right Allens. Um, so sometimes it's a matter of checking Find a Grave, um, and knowing what the stone might look like, but also checking for all of the related family members. Now, there are some cemeteries, Forest Lawn in Norfolk is one. The city of Norfolk manages that cemetery. It's huge. It's like 164 acres. It's massive. And they have a locator that doesn't give you a picture, but it does tell you name, uh, section, and plot, basically. And I had three related people that I needed to find there, and they were in sections adjacent to each other. Um, but I luckily we got to the right section of the thing, and I had been there as a kid, so I vaguely knew where it was, and I just had to trust that muscle memory of it's kind of this far from the road and it's facing that way. And it did not take long to find it. So yeah, it, having some preparation really does help, especially in a situation where it's that large a cemetery. Um, when I was at St. George's Episcopal Cemetery in on the Eastern Shore, um, for another set of great grandparents, um, still don't understand why they are completely on the opposite end of a row from the rest of the family. But that may just have been they thought it was adjacent and it just happened to be at the end of the previous row. I'm not sure. But yeah, and that one I definitely do not recommend going there in sandals in June, in the end of June. I got bug bit very much. again, so sometimes I follow best practices and sometimes I take the 5 minutes, 15 minutes that I have that, hey, if I go this way, I'll go past that cemetery and I can check in on my people. Um, so it just
Okay.
depends.
Um, so there are no other questions, and I just wanted to remind everybody that's still listening that you're taking suggestions for next year's uh, each monthly
Yes.
program.
Yes. Yeah, please feel free to send us a line at the K Room at infodepot.org. If you have a topic that you would like, um, again, particularly South Carolina related, but it could be any genealogy topic. I try to mix things up a little bit, so I'm not doing the same nine uh, presentations every year. I get bored with that, and I know my listeners get bored with that as well. Oh, earlier somebody asked about the YouTube page. If you go to spartanburglibraries.org, at the bottom, usually at the bottom, there's the little YouTube symbol. Click that, it'll take you to the library's YouTube page, and there is a genealogy playlist in the playlists. We've kind of gotten buried at the bottom because we were one of the first playlists. And so, but we're there, and this presentation should be up usually by about Wednesday or Thursday, they get it up. We have to get the Zoom download and then send that to someone in our marketing department, and they are the one who puts it up. And you can see all the vast majority of my programs since April or May 2020 when we first started going online. So they are like this. They are a recording of what happened live. And when I lose my train of thought, I lose my train of thought. But glad that you came along and hope that you have some um, good experience. And no, unfortunately, we don't have a handout this time. Um, because I did not get all of the notes written out. Um, but yeah, you can watch the recording again. So usually I do have notes because I'm a very visual person, so I apologize for that. But um, glad you came, and we will see you. Our next presentation will be in October, first Monday of October, and I may throw a beginning genealogy workshop in at some point on Zoom. So we'll get an email out to those who have participated. So um, really appreciate you coming tonight. Really appreciate you supporting the series, and we'll see you next time. Come visit us in Spartanburg at the Kennedy Room if you happen to be in the area.
Good night, everyone.
Okay, and we can hit record off.